I would have to say Danny Werfel.
Number 2.
Chris Leak.
Chris Leak, number 1 all time.
Yeah, because I think Chris Leak's like 3rd or 4th in SEC history in passing yards.
Dude was there forever. Another guy that was at Florida seemingly forever. Number 3, Shane Matthews, though. And Emmitt Smith, not number 1 all-time rushing for them.
Is it? It's not Tim Tebow, is it?
No, I don't think you're gonna get it.
Eric Rett.
Yeah, it's Eric Rett.
Oh, don't knock my '90s Florida knowledge, sir.
There you go. I just wouldn't have guessed that because it was the run and shoot, and it was just the prolific offense and pass. Chris Doering and friends.
I didn't even think of Fred Taylor. I probably would have said Fred Taylor if I would have thought of them.
Okay.
I was a big Fred Taylor guy. Jacksonville, the black visor. Oh yeah, Fred Taylor.
Don't let a lot of Georgia fans hear that, Matt Green.
Hey, Fred Taylor, I respect the game. The Jaguars I loved when Jacksonville first came along. They just they really killed their uniforms, or they killed it with their uniforms just right out of the gate. And then I don't know why they started messing with it in the last decade. They don't know what they're doing.
Brands just get antsy, and teams are like, we have to do it because this is what we've been forever.
They were just like the Panthers. The Panthers and the Jaguars came in the league together. They killed it.
Panthers are still pretty clean.
Uniforms. Yeah, they didn't need to change them, and I'm glad the Panthers have held on to them. Texans too. Like they just came right in, nailed it the first time.
There you go. Where are we going next?
Uniform talk for the. So
well, let's not conclude it. I
maybe I won't make any promises. Next, we got the Georgia Bulldogs at 11.5, sir. So what are you thinking with the Dogs? They're gonna have a second straight regular undefeated regular season.
I don't. I think I'm going under. I think it's 11-1. I think 11-1 is where I'm at with them. I think not to go full Chris Doering here with the 11-1 Kentucky Wildcats, but I think the one loss for Georgia is Tennessee. I feel it in my bones is that Tennessee is going to beat Georgia, and they are going to lose a game in Columbia where I am losing my absolute mind and attendance in November to the Gamecocks in the dumbest game possible, and not following through on finally getting over the Florida and Georgia hump by losing the dumbest game possible late in the season to another inferior SEC East school. So 11-1 feels about right to me for the Dogs.
See, I tend to think if that was on the road, I think I've said that a few times. If that was on the road, I would feel a lot worse about that game. And it's interesting positioned where it is right behind Florida. I don't think Georgia's ever played Florida, Tennessee back to back. It's a very new scheduling situation there. But I think the best opportunities for Georgia to lose is either at South Carolina week 3 or I tend to think they make it to November undefeated.
Well, hold on. How is this going to affect your wedding vibes if they do go down?
South Carolina? That'd be a real buzzkill. Might not even show up for that. Might just turn around and go home.
Well, that's like half my family, like a bunch of people, like the vibe in the Chase Thomas podcast.
Sure, you got to be rooting for Georgia that day.
You're telling me.
So yeah, but South Carolina is still like that's wanting South Carolina to take a big step in year 2 if we're talking about beating Georgia. Although, did you see the light show that got leaked? The Williams-Brice, the sandstorm.
Is it cool?
Oh man, I got juiced for it. A lot of people, Sandstorm has a lot of love or hate vibes. I feel like
anyone who hates that is just out of their mind. Like we pick on South Carolina, but they nail it with their home atmosphere and everything.
Saying, like I would never listen to a rave music like that any other time, but it gets you going. I'm a big fan of the Sandstorm.
I was freezing my ass off at the Tennessee Georgia game where Georgia fans just took over in that fourth quarter. That people forget that Georgia fans just overtook Neyland Stadium as every Tennessee fan left, as seen by the black coats and black attire.
Colors don't lie.
Yeah,
but yeah, they have the new light show and everything like everyone's getting. So it was a pretty cool little video that got leaked online. So you should check it out. But
I mean, doesn't Georgia do that too? Like everybody does the light show now.
Yeah, everyone's got it, but they also had it going with the
they actually have a song. Yeah, they have like a guaranteed song with it that makes it even better. Yeah,
exactly. But that's gonna be a noon game with Georgia, so you can't utilize it, But it's gonna be 100 degrees, I'm sure. So yeah, I think Georgia gets to November undefeated, and then you got Tennessee at Mississippi State, at Kentucky, and then Georgia Tech. I think those
Mississippi State's
Tennessee,
the only other one, right?
State,
Like
I think those
Mississippi
are
State.
exactly. I think those are the toughest games. The cowbell,
They
just
played
Mississippi
y'all
State.
tough.
Exactly. Mississippi State's gonna get someone. There's a few teams that go to Starkville this year that are gonna be maybe top 10 or so. And I think Mississippi State's gonna get somebody, but I think Georgia's gonna be much better offensively this year than they were, or maybe not much better, but I should say just even better. Like they're just gonna be like a crisper offense. Like I think we're kind of downplaying that Stetson Bennett has never been going through the offseason as through the spring, through the summer as the number one guy. And there's a lot of first team reps that he's never gotten as the established starter on the team. And I think that should help him a lot in his second full season as the starter under Todd Monken. I think we've talked about the tight end room is just absolutely loaded. And I think the receiving group, it might not be filled with those top tier first round George Pickens types, but it's just a lot of good receivers. So I feel like it's 4 or 5 deep and just good receivers. And then that tight end room, you're talking about, maybe 2 or 3 first round picks in that tight end room. Like those guys, if they reach their potential, I think the offensive line should be even better. And then the defense, it just under Kirby Smart, under Will Muschamp, Glenn Schumann, it's hard to see this defense being anything other than really good. So if they're just as good at offensively as they were a year ago, maybe even a little better, I think there's a chance they're like not quite as good of a team as they were last year, but there's still no one on the schedule that necessarily scares you enough. I think it is a favorable schedule, and so I'm going to go over. I'm going to take Georgia going undefeated regular season for the second straight year.
My 2 biggest questions with Georgia. Number 1, you talk about the offense. One of the things that Georgia fans get antsy about this, you bring this up. We have not seen them play from behind all that much, where that's something I want to see is Georgia and Stetson Bennett have to play from behind, because one of the things about Stetson Bennett that a lot of folks miss is that he's not a game manager. The man's a gunslinger. And
that's true.
Like, what happens if they're down 17-7 at the half against Oregon, and Oregon's healthy defensively and they're good, and Dan Lanning, just knowing Stetson Bennett really, really well, just causes all kinds of havoc for him in the opener. Like, I want to see what this Georgia team looks like when they can't run the ball down your throats and just run like they're up 30-0 before you know it. Like, I want to see when they have to rely on Stetson to do stuff with Ladd McConkey and not just focus on the tight ends and just be able to play that big set that they're going to want to play a lot. Like, I'm curious to see what Georgia's offense looks like when they're playing from behind, because they have not been challenged all that much in the Stetson Bennett time of him under center. So when we talk about Stetson and how great he was last year, he really was never behind. Like, he stepped up in the national title game, and that was huge. But I would like to see a little bit more, because it was such a rare thing, and Tennessee and Georgia's numbers offensively are nearly identical across the board when you look through them. Tennessee had to play from behind, or Hendon Hooker had to play from a position where it's like, the defense is not getting a stop here. So I have to keep coming back out and I have to keep scoring, and this is just how it goes. Georgia's not in that spot, and I don't think with their loss of production on defense, it's going to be a big thing. But speaking of loss of production, my second thing about them is they are 12th in returning production in the SEC next year. So doesn't mean the sky is falling. It just means that they're going to have a lot of new faces. It means a lot of extremely talented players will be stepping in, and it's a new co-DCs. We don't know what Will Muschamp and what Glenn Schulman, is it
Schumann, yeah.
Schumann, yeah. Are going to be like as co-DCs. Does that work seamlessly? Is that just like they pick up right where Dan Lanning left off? We'll see. Those are things I'm very, very curious about. And if I think those are fair, right? Those are fair questions for Georgia. Is like what Stetson Bennett and this offense looks like if they have to play from behind and really have to struggle where the defense isn't 100%. The defense isn't overwhelming, and they're in a shootout against Tennessee this year where the first quarter adjustments don't hang on. It's like, no, you're going to be in this game with them until the fourth quarter, and Stetson's going to have to go throw for throw and can't do the Will Levis pick that cost Kentucky basically against Tennessee, where Kentucky was going back and forth in Tennessee at home. Will Levis had a pick 6 to Alontae Taylor, and that kind of put Tennessee up 2 scores, and it was just really, really tough for Kentucky to come back. But I wonder what happens there. It's not going to happen often. It might happen only once in the regular season, but I think it will be interesting to see if that's the case.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to know until you know, right? So the fact that you didn't see it much from Georgia last year, it's like it's hard to think you're going to see it much this year because I think the offensive line should be much improved this year. I think Tate Ratledge is a guy who got hurt like the third play of the game, I think, versus Clemson, missed the entire season. He's also had another injury that in this fall camp, so he's a guy that I think it should have been a starter at guard all year last year. And then Broderick Jones slid in the national championship at left tackle. And I think that's a guy who's a future first rounder personally. I think Broderick Jones is an elite talent. And I think the running game, there's kind of this perception of Georgia of what they were that, oh, they just run the ball and they don't really, the passing game is just kind of secondary. But in the first half of games, like when the game is in the balance, I think Graham Coffey had a great stat showing this. Like Georgia's passing offense was basically equivalent to Ohio State and CJ Stroud, like in the first half of games. And it was better than the Oklahomas of the world. It was better than a lot of other teams in the country last year. But then they just got up on teams and and coasted. So as good as the offense was, I feel like it could have been even better if they actually were in close games and they weren't just had things wrapped up halfway through the third quarter. But also, Zamir White he's not DeAndre Swift, right? He's not Sony Michel or Todd Gurley. He's not any of these stud running backs. Like James Cook was a good change of pace weapon. These guys weren't necessarily the elite, Georgia running backs that they've had typically. I think Kendall Milton, he might have some of that 5-star potential. Like Kenny McIntosh, I think he has more of that DeAndre Swift game breaker potential than a Zamir White had. So this offense, with Nick Chubb and Sony Michel, those two guys combined for I think 2,400 yards in 2017 when Georgia won the national championship. James Cook and Zamir White combined for 1,500 yards last year. It was not a dominant run game or anything. So I think the Georgia passing offense, I don't think necessarily gets enough credit. And even if it is not the receivers, it's just the tight ends, Brock Bowers couldn't be stopped last year. So if Eric Gilbert, if he's what he was supposed to be coming out of high school, it's hard. I would definitely see Georgia's top two receiving leaders being their top two tight ends. So I think they're loaded with playmakers, and I tend to just give Kirby the benefit of the doubt that the defense is going to be good. As much as they did lose, they still bring back Jalen Carter, who was arguably the best defensive lineman on the team last year. The guy just wreaks havoc. And while they might not be as deep on the defensive line, having the one guy that's maybe the best defensive lineman in the entire country, I think could kind of equalize that. And then you also got Nolan Smith, Keely Ringo, Chris Smith, a couple returning starters. So as much as I think Georgia might take a step back, I don't know if there's anyone that can necessarily expose them on their schedule. I think that's why South Carolina early, the third game, that feels more dangerous than Mississippi State late.
That's interesting. I feel like Mississippi State's more dangerous for them. And we'll get into Mississippi State. I'm just pretty high on them, and I'm a lot higher on Mississippi State than South Carolina. And I also just saw South Carolina give them hell. Mississippi State give Georgia a lot of hell when Will Rogers was a virtual unknown at that point a couple of years back. So I don't know. It's a different kind of style. It kind of reminds me of the what always plagues Saban, right? Is the Hugh Freeze types. The Gus Malzahn offenses are the ones that get them. And I think Kirby, getting got by a Mike Leach offense would not be the most surprising thing in the world. Where Kentucky tries to beat Georgia playing Georgia football, and you're like, oh, you're just going to get your ass kicked. This is never going to work. They're just a matchup problem. But you go at them where you're like Mississippi State, and where our run plays are 2-yard screens out wide. We're never going up the middle against you. We're not going up against Jalen Carter and company.
And I think that's part of it. Why Kentucky just doesn't really scare Georgia fans. It's okay, yeah. The people that are predicting Kentucky, it's they're a 9-10 potential 10-win team, and it's on the road at Kentucky. Yeah, it fits the formula for an upset, but it's they're not gonna beat Georgia. They're not gonna out Georgia. Whereas Tennessee, they're an actual dangerous opponent. But I think Tennessee was that game last year that, okay, if we got to score a little bit, someone's going to, punch us in the mouth. You got to punch him back. I think that was a really like a character building game for Georgia last year. Like Tennessee just drove right down the field on that first possession, and for Georgia to just respond the way they did. And